Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Corey, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello humans, it's your host Corey, and this week we're going to talk about self-destruction. Now this is a requested episode. In fact, he asked for self-destruction and self-sabotage, but they're not quite the same thing, so I'll have to do a separate episode for self-sabotage. But self-destruction, I don't know if the recording gods will be with me today, given that yappy dog in the back, which is not my boy. My sweet boy is asleep on the floor here, but we'll do our best. And so self-destruction is when we have such a self-loathing, such a sense of worthlessness, such a low self-esteem that we actually do things to harm ourselves rather than take good care of ourselves. And so self-destruction can be manifested in many different ways. It could be substance use. It could be actual physical harm. So, for example, I used to cut on myself. It could be eating disorders, punishing your body in any kind of way, whether restricting what you eat or eating but then not being allowed to keep it, like I struggled with when I was bulimic. It could be really reckless behavior, like driving all over the place really fast, not wearing your seatbelt, not caring if you get hurt, not wearing your helmet when you ride a motorcycle. And I know some people, they just don't like it because it's not cool. Same for bikes, right? Bicycles, it's not fun to wear your helmet necessarily, but just this disregard for your own safety, however that would be manifest for each person is going to be different. But this idea that you don't care what happens to you. In fact, in some extreme cases, as was the case with my mother, you actually invite people to come hurt you or situations to come hurt you. You tempt fate. You're like, come in here and try this. And that's really just dependent on where you are on the scale. So there is a bit of a spectrum. So I had some self-harm behaviors, but my mother's were more extreme. And so you see this in different people depending on what they're dealing with. Now, what creates a desire to hurt yourself? Often it's unresolved trauma. It can also be, the low sense of self-worth. It could be a lot of emotional pain that you don't know how else to deal with, and so you're trying to escape from it by hurting yourself or putting yourself in dangerous situations or disregarding yourself in any kind of other capacity. And so if you have this low self-worth, low self-esteem, you don't love yourself, you have a lot of emotional pain that you don't know how to process, you don't know how to deal with, you don't know how to sit with, and then you're also trying to, I don't want to say hurt yourself specifically because it can be intentional or unintentional. So there are those who know that they're hurting themselves and they want to hurt themselves and it's a conscious decision. But then there are those of us who were doing it unintentionally. There was no clarity that it was coming from this place of I don't love myself, I don't like myself, I don't know what to do with this emotional pain. And so it doesn't matter if the self-destruction is intentional or unintentional. They usually come from a similar constellation of issues, which is this unresolved pain, unresolved trauma, and how that has created this low sense of self-worth, this low sense of self-love. And so what can we do about that? Well, let me share a little bit more about my own experiences with self-destruction and also my mother's to kind of give you a better sense of this scale. And then I'll talk about what I did to unravel them. Because when I think of self-destructive tendencies, I imagine one of those big tangled balls of Christmas lights. I'm sure we've all seen those where it's like the lights get so twisted that they're just like this giant mess and you have to slowly kind of pick it apart. And I feel that self-destruction is the same way. This is clearly not like a clinical definition of self-destruction, but it did seem to me that it wasn't just one thing that created my self-destructive tendencies. It was a lot of interconnected pieces. And so in order to understand it, in order to break those habits, those self-destructive habits, I kind of had to tease apart the different pieces of it to get that strand, right, to straighten out. And so it takes different tactics, it takes different understandings of the situation of how things are playing together to start to unravel self-destruction. And so if you're someone who is struggling with substance use, you're struggling with self-harm, or maybe eating disorders, or in an abusive situation, like you allow others to abuse you because you feel like maybe you deserve it or you don't deserve anything better, or you put yourself in these really physically or emotionally or sexually dangerous situations because you have such low self-worth, there's probably multiple factors of what's going on there. And so let's look at what the suspects would be, like what would be the different pieces that might be creating this, and then hopefully perhaps you can identify which ones it is that you're working with. So there could be the trauma, the unresolved trauma. In my case, there was a lot of emotional abuse from my narcissistic father, a lot of him telling me how I was never good enough, how nothing I would do would be good enough, how I was basically a worthless human being, and how I internalized all of that shame, that self-rejection. And so that was a piece of the Christmas lights, right? That was a piece of the self-loathing that created this aversion to myself, to my body particularly. He was very abusive toward my body, but also just toward my mind, toward my mental state. He liked to try to convince me that I was no better than my mother. That's something that he said often. I think my mother was an amazing person. She had a lot of problems, obviously, which I've talked about at length in this show and in the Who Killed My Mother podcast, but I think she still had worth as a human being, and that she was still a lovable and incredible person despite the things that happened to her. So when I say as worthless as she is, I just want you to know that I'm using his words, his perspective, his mentality, not my view of my mother. And so this idea that I was never going to be any better than her, that I was as worthless as she was, that I had all these issues, these problems, and they were my own fault because I was too weak or too stupid to fix them. So all of that psychological and emotional abuse, that created part of my self-loathing, the not loving myself, not thinking I'm worth it as a human being. Because if you're hearing that stuff as a little kid, which I would have been probably 8, 9, 10 years old when a lot of this was happening, so pretty young. He had gone to prison. He probably was doing it even before that, but he went to prison for those years. And so when he got out of prison, that's when it started up again. And so this idea that he created this sense of low self-worth in me. Also, there was a bit of it from my mother because she struggled so much with substance use and with her own mental stability that she was not very consistent. She was not there for me very well as a parent, as a mother. And so there would be this part of me that felt like, well, am I not good enough as a kid to have a mother that would, straighten up for me, that she would love me, that she would be there for me? Am I not worth it to her? Am I not good enough to her? I don't feel that way now as an adult, now that I know what's happened to her, the things that went on with her, why she was the way she was, what was her situation. I don't feel that way anymore. But as a kid, I didn't understand, right? I didn't know anything about her past. I didn't know what had gone on. And so I didn't have a good sense of why she was the way she was. And I took it personally as a little kid. I took it personally that she wasn't a good mom to me. I thought it must be because there was something wrong with me as a kid. And that's why she didn't want to be a good mom to me, even though there were still moments where she was an amazing mother to me. And in some ways, she always got it right, like how verbally affirming she was to me. So she was very good at telling me that, you're perfect, you're beautiful, I love you so much. So she was very verbally affirming, even though her actions did not always support those perspectives. she would say that, but then also she would get really drunk and disappear for 3 days, so there was some inconsistency, but she was still very verbally affirming. And so this idea that my sense of low self-worth was probably created by these interactions with my parents, by this unresolved trauma, by the domestic violence that I witnessed, by the self-destructive tendencies of my mother that I witnessed. So she was someone who was very caught up in her unresolved trauma. When my mother was a child, she was sexually assaulted. She had many things happen to her when she was very young, and so she grew up feeling very helpless. She had learned helplessness, and I have a whole episode and stuff about that, so please revisit that if you want to know more about learned helplessness. It's a really interesting and kind of complex issue, learned helplessness. But anyway, so she had learned helplessness. So she did a lot of these self-harm coping mechanisms in which she used substances or alcohol. Her choice was particularly pills. I have a story in the book that I talk about how I could open cabinet after cabinet after cabinet after cabinet, and there would just be these orange pill bottles all along the shelves. This is how medicated she was. And doctors gave her this. Like, instead of actually helping her, these doctors would just prescribe her something else to try to deal with her symptoms and emotions. And so this idea that she was abusing pills, that she was using alcohol, relying on alcohol to try to cope with this emotional pain that she didn't know how to process. And so she was under-resourced. She was not getting the mental health care that she needed, or the physical health care either. And so that was one layer. But this tendency to put herself in physically dangerous situations. And so she would go out with really sketchy people, disappear with them for days. You didn't know what this guy was going to do to you. Or like, she could have easily ended up in a garbage bag buried in someone's backyard or in the bottom of a lake. The kind of people that she ran around with sometimes. It was very dangerous, and she did that because she did not have a very high regard for her body, for her safety, and so that's another expression of self-harm. And so she was more, I want to say, severe in her expressions of self-harm than I was. My self-harm was still pretty serious, and I needed a lot of help and attention, which fortunately I got. She did not get the help and attention she needed, and it resulted in her murder, which is kind of the ultimate expression of self-harm, in the sense that she stayed in this house with her abuser for many, many years, and it resulted in her death. And so that's the more extreme version of self-harm, is that you would get to a point to where someone who does not deserve to have access to you when you need more help and care, but it's just not available. And so this is what occurs. I don't want to make it sound like my mother deserved to be murdered, because that's absolutely not true. And I don't think people who stay in domestic violence situations deserve to have the things that happen to them. I also don't think that they necessarily can be blamed for where they are, because it depends on why they're stuck there. Are they getting enough help to get out of it and be in a different situation? Because sometimes it's like you literally have to make these difficult decisions in order to survive and to stay alive. And so I don't want to, you got to be careful when you talk about self-harm and letting things happen. It's like, are you blaming people? I want to be absolutely clear that I'm not blaming anyone here, that I think that there are these larger systemic issues that contribute to this, and it's important to be aware of that. But this idea that when you don't know what to do with the emotional pain, you don't know what to do with what's happened to you, and you don't know how to escape, what you do is you turn it in on yourself. Not for everyone, but a lot of us, we turn it in on ourselves, and we punish ourselves. And we punish ourselves doing these different things, using drugs and alcohol, running off with people we shouldn't be running off with. That was definitely the case with me. I wasn't going with anyone that was so sketchy that it was possible that I could have ended up in a body bag somewhere. It wasn't that extreme, but I did get into these really unhealthy, toxic situations with people who were going to mistreat me because that's who they were. They were going to make me feel worse about myself, because it was a form of self-punishment, and so it was a form of self-harm. So choosing relationships that are unhealthy, that don't love and support you. So there's definitely that aspect of it. Relationships, actually causing physical harm, or just using things to kind of medicate, numb out, escape your situation and the emotional pain that you don't know how to process. And so if you have that going on, if you recognize yourself in any of these descriptions, either a more extreme version like my mother, or this, I don't even want to say mild, because I would definitely say it wasn't mild. My own self-harm was not mild. I was bulimic and anorexic at different points of my life, so I was harming my body that way. I cut myself. I definitely used substances, not alcohol. I was really scared of alcohol for some reason, and I just didn't trust myself to drink, and so I didn't drink, but I used other substances to deal with emotional pain, and so I did use drugs, and I definitely had terrible, toxic relationships that could reinforce my terrible self-view to show me what an awful person I was, who deserved to be with people who would hurt me. So there was that too. So I wouldn't call that mild. Let's say I'm moderate to severe. Mom, very severe. Me, moderate to severe. And so if you recognize yourself in any of this, even if you only have one of these things, then that means you have some self-destructive tendencies that you need to address. And understanding that there's probably some trauma there that hasn't been processed, that there's probably some emotional pain that you're dealing with that you don't know what to do with. You don't know how to work with those strong, difficult emotions. Like, it's probably very painful. My mother, for example, had PTSD, and so she would have these really intense flashbacks of the things that had happened to her as a child. And so that's going to mess a person up, and it's going to make them feel, in her case, I'm sure she felt crazy. And she had said that to me several times growing up. She was like, I feel so crazy. And I think it's just that she was not supported and that she needed more care than the world was willing to give her. But that's a whole different rant. We need better systems. That's a different, I feel like that's not just an episode, that's like a whole book or franchise or something. System. It's a whole new mental health care system. But staying on focus just for today's episode, that's a different issue. And so thinking about, if you have self-destruction, what are these components, again, of that big bundle? Is it emotional pain? Is it unresolved trauma? Is it this habitual response? Because at some point, the substance use, the numbing out, the terrible relationships, they become habitual. So even if you're no longer in abusive relationships, for example, so I had a lot of trauma growing up, escaped my family, I'm now on my own. No one's actively abusing me anymore, right? But I have so many habits, so many poor coping mechanisms that now it's habitual. This process of hurting myself is habitual. Is it just a habit for you at this point? Maybe you're looking at yourself and you're like, I don't know why I do these things to me. I don't know. You probably had a reason. There's a reason why those Christmas lights got tangled up. You just don't necessarily remember it, or you're far enough away from it that what's left is just this residue. This, in my book, A Well Cared For Human, I talk about it as venom. I say that there are two levels to healing yourself. There was the actual terrible thing that happened. I refer to it as a snake bite. And every time I talk about the snake bite, I'm like, don't blame the snake. I love snakes. They're very important to the ecosystem. And so don't blame the snakes, but it's useful for this metaphor. This idea that a snake bites you, getting away from the snake, that's one thing. Dealing with the venom that they left coursing in your veins, that's something entirely different. And so you might be at that point where you're processing the venom with less memory of the actual attack itself. And so untangling these Christmas lights might also include this idea of forgiving yourself if you don't really remember what happened, not blaming yourself or not distrusting yourself, being like, well, there's no reason for you to be the way that you are. Maybe there is. You just don't remember what that reason was. You don't remember what happened. And that might be a self-protection mechanism. And so try not to make it harder on yourself with self-judgment, self-criticism, giving yourself a hard time. Oh, I don't know why you can't just stop being addicted to pills. I don't know why you just can't stop, shooting up crack cocaine. These are all things that my mother used or struggled with at some point. I can't imagine someone just going up to her and being like, it's your own fault that you're addicted to these things. Like, pull yourself together. It's like, well, do you know why she is the way she is? And so be aware that there's a reason why this is a mess and why you're coping with that mess in these ways, because it's really hard to deal with this mess and you're doing what you can, even though it's harmful and it's self-destructive. Just be compassionate with yourself. There's some reason why this happened, and you beating yourself up about it's not going to make you stop doing these self-destruction things. In fact, it's just going to make it worse. The reason why you're self-destructive is because you don't love and appreciate yourself. You don't believe in yourself necessarily. You don't care about yourself. You don't have great self-worth, self-care strategies. And so you coming in and being more aggressive and abusive with yourself is not going to resolve the tendency or the habit to self-harm, right? So be aware of that. Don't tangle the lights more with your own stuff. And so how do we untangle the lights though? How do we start to process this in healthy ways? Well, what I did was I got into therapy. I really needed someone to help me process the unresolved trauma and the emotional pain. I couldn't do it on my own. There was just too many layers from both sides. All my dad's BS, all my mom's BS, my family dynamics, my own stuff that I had gone through, like bullying, hurtful relationships, things that had traumatized me apart from my family. I got it from everywhere. I got a healthy dose from everyone. And so I needed someone to help me sort through all that, to actually pick those strands apart, try to sort out what things were. Also to give me perspective, to show me how to have compassion for myself, that I'm not doing these things, these self-harm things, because I'm a bad person. I'm doing these things because this terrible stuff happened to me. Kind of what I did with my mother. Like when I learned about the things that happened to my mom, I was able to forgive her because I was like, oh, it wasn't personal that you did these things. This is the life that you lived. These are the horrible experiences that happened to you. Of course you became like this. And then I had to do it for myself. These are the terrible things that happened to you. Of course it looks like this. And so I needed help to go through that, so I got into therapy. I learned a lot of healthy coping mechanisms that were not self-harm coping mechanisms. So the usual suspects: meditation, journaling, positive self-talk, surrounding myself by healthy relationships, healthy people, rewiring how I react to situations. So in the past, a really strong emotion comes up, let's say fear, terror, anger. Self-harm is the thing that I would have done to cope with that feeling. I couldn't reach for that anymore. I needed to break that habit of the self-harm tactic. So I needed to have a new habit in its place. Well, I had to figure out what that was going to be, and I had to do some trial and error and figure out what was going to work. Sometimes journaling when you have a panic attack, that doesn't work. It's not enough to bring you down, right? And so you have to find the techniques that actually work with whatever it is that you're struggling with. And so it does involve some trial and error. It does involve a lot of patience. You didn't get to the point of self-harm in one day, and you're not going to get away from your self-harm in one day either. And that might seem really hopeless, like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine sitting in this and doing these things to myself any longer. It's great that you're fed up with that. That's excellent. That's one of the things that will make it easier for you to shift away and to process these things and start to, the word would be disidentify, probably. I might be making up that word. But this idea of when we identify with our self-harm as like, this is just who I am. I'm just this terrible person. I just do these awful things. I can't stop using. I can't stop getting in these awful relationships. I'm just a mess. When we identify with that, it's harder to walk away from it. It's harder to process that tendency, those habits. And so realizing, like, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't stand this. I can't stand myself like this. That's good. That's actually great, because that means that you have a better chance of breaking those habits off completely. Basically, any self-harm habit you have, whether that's physically hurting yourself, whether that's using substances to numb out or to escape, whether that's putting yourself in difficult situations, dangerous situations, whether that's sabotaging your relationships or your own happiness, whatever it is, that is in reaction to something. That's a coping mechanism that you developed in reaction to something, a trauma, emotional pain, something. And you can develop healthier coping mechanisms to process that instead. Instead of this being what you reach for, there are other things that you can learn to reach for. It's just going to take time and patience and practice and help. Sometimes we need a lot of help, especially with self-destruction, because if you're at the point of self-destruction, that means that things are really tangled up, right? And it's really hard to do that by yourself. And so I would recommend you getting help if you're a very self-destructive person. I don't know how I would have cured myself of my self-destruction if I didn't have help. And so it's hesitant. The reason why I'm hesitating is because in America, we don't have a lot of mental health support. It's expensive to get therapists. It's expensive to do things. And so maybe if you're looking for low-cost solutions, see if you have insurance. See if it will cover, because my insurance did cover my therapy sessions. I became a graduate student, and my graduate package came with a mental health, like 20 sessions or something. I milked that for all it was worth. I ended up with a really big bill after, and so it came with it. But I feel like that money was so well spent. It basically saved my life. And so I don't want to tell you to go into debt or anything for your mental health, but I also want to be like, how are you going to live without it? Like, what are your alternatives? So getting help, finding someone to help you. There's also low cost options as far as maybe there are books or courses or tutorials that you can do to help you work with different things. But just definitely do the work to break those self-harm habits, because you are a worthy person. You are worthy of being loved and cared for and respected and treated well. And the first step in getting that is giving it to yourself. And so you need to start looking at what's making you hate yourself, essentially. What's making you be unkind to yourself, to mistreat yourself. And what can we do to lessen the power that those experiences or that emotional pain has over you, so that you can get farther away from it. I want to end on a hopeful note. And I'll do that by telling you this one story, which is that I was so low at one point. My self-harm tendencies were so high that I almost ended it all. I almost unalived myself. I don't think I can say the actual word on YouTube or social media, so I'm using these metaphors, but we know what I'm talking about, right? I almost ended everything for myself. And that came to that point because I was so consumed by my emotional pain, I just could not imagine another day with it. I just couldn't imagine. And this experience that stopped me, that made me think, okay, no, I have to get help. And then I literally went into therapy like the next day and was like, I need someone to work with me now, or this is it. And what made me stop myself was that senior year of high school, when I was 17, my English teacher made us write a letter to ourselves, to our future selves, 10 years in the future. So I had written at 17 a letter to my 27-year-old self. And in this letter, I had written all the things that I had hoped for in my life. Like, I hope that at 27, I'm doing this, this, and this. I hope that I've gone to Italy and Greece already. I hope that... So there was like a list of things that I had hoped to accomplish. And it was also super dramatic. I'm never going to share this letter with anybody because it was like something a 17-year-old would write. So dramatic, so into it. But what happened that night that I decided that I couldn't take it anymore is I was like, I had carried this letter for 7 years at this point. And I was like, I'm not going to do this without reading this letter, because I can't leave this world without reading the letter that I carried for 7 years. I was like, I have to know what it says. And so it had only been 7 years at that point, because I was 24, and I opened it up and I read it. And I was just like, I can't end this person. So I didn't feel like her. I didn't feel like her anymore. But I also didn't feel like I could hurt her. You know what I mean? And so it was like, oh. And so that was the first shift for me, being like, I don't want to hurt her anymore. Even though I didn't fully identify with her. Because really what I was saying is I don't want to hurt myself, right? But I didn't fully identify with this sweet honey child, 17-year-old honey child at 24. Too much had happened. But this idea that I didn't want to hurt her. And that was enough. That was just enough to like create that wedge to go get help and to change the trajectory of my life. And so I just want to tell you that it can be something so small, like the smallest shift, to set you on the right path. And now I'm so far away from wanting to hurt myself. I'm so far away that I can't imagine, oh my gosh, I'm going to get upset. I can't imagine having ended it there. And so if you're someone who got that close, or you are that close right now, know that it's the smallest, tiniest thing that can shift you away from that and that can change everything. And so just don't give up. Don't give up on yourself, even if you're feeling really self-destructive, even if you're feeling like you can't possibly go on, that there's nothing for you. There is. There absolutely is. And just in a few short years, you can feel so different about yourself. You could feel completely different about who you are. You could never imagine. I'm going to take a moment and compose myself and come back. Hold on. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I went and kissed my dog like 100 times. I'm fine. But it's really true. I feel so differently about myself now. I can't imagine harming myself the ways that I did in the past. And now my dog just kicked my tripod. The dog that was cheering me up 5 seconds ago. Now I'm annoyed with him already. But things can change so quickly for you. This idea that you can be so caught up in the self-destructive cycle, you can really truly hate yourself and everything about yourself to the point to where you would do anything to escape yourself, including ending it all. You can be so low and change everything with just that smallest, tiniest shift, with that smallest, tiniest decision that no, I'm going to keep going, I'm going to keep trying. So please don't give up on yourself, because I absolutely know, sitting here now, that things can be so different for you. I can't imagine doing the things to myself now that I used to do to myself in the past. That's how far I've come and how much I've grown over the years. And building your relationship with yourself, everything that we've talked about so far, and that I talk about in my book too, A Well-Cared For Human, working on those foundational principles of changing the way you talk to yourself, changing the way that you think about yourself, changing the way you speak about yourself, and investing in those 4 pillars, that will change everything. It will completely change your desire to hurt yourself, to harm yourself. And so just keep going, keep investing in that relationship, and know that everything will be different for you if you just give yourself more time. And that's it for today, dear human. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found the episode useful. Self-harm is a difficult topic, and if you are struggling, please reach out and get help. It's not something that most of us can do on our own, and so please know there's no shame in that. I needed help. You may need help too, and that's perfectly okay. If you have any questions about the episode or you want to reach out to me, please do. either through my email, Corey@CoreyMstrom.com, or through any of my social media. I love to hear from you guys. I'd love to help you, so reach out to me if you need to. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human, and until then, please, please, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Corey Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Corey Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.